Good morning. This is Dr. Obertashaka. This is the 10th of the Dr. Obertashaka shows. And this is in many ways a follow-up on some other themes for three shows. Good morning. This is Dr. Obertashaka. This is the 10th of the Dr. Obertashaka shows. And this is in many ways a follow-up on some other themes for three shows. Good morning. This is Dr. Obertashaka. For the last three shows, I've covered the process of identity transformation and preparations for it. The very last one was on the spiritual blues, which is the high point of African American culture. And so all of these are giving people a foundation for getting into a deep system of self-love. So we're exploring African and African American culture. We do both. And so today you're in for a special treat. The subject for this morning's discussion is armed resistance traditions and their connections to African American armed resistance traditions, starting with African arms traditions. Our guest is very special. It's a brother I've known for about 46 or 47 years. He has the same face, a little different, but basically the same face, same voice, and really a nice presence, a brilliant brother. We have today the honor of having Dr. Akinyele Umoja, who is an expert on African American history and particularly on movements of resistance. And he has written a book on We'll Shoot Back, which in another form was a PhD dissertation. So this is a brother that only a few people put a smile on my face, when I talk about him. He's one of them. He's both an activist and he's a scholar. And so that's not usual among our scholars. Born in 1954, so I often refer to him as a youngster, but that's because I was born a lot sooner. Most of you looking here, you're going to say, youngster, what are you talking about? Yeah, well, it depends on your age. He is a full professor at Georgia State University, where he was chair of African American Studies. He's a founding member of the African Peoples Organization. I got to know him as a member of the African Peoples Organization, which is a successor of RAM, Revolutionary Action Movement. Most listeners and observers here won't know what RAM was, some will. It's one of the radical organizations coming out of the 60s. And it's an organization that had a big impact on the thinking of a lot of people in the movement and shaped some very important ideas. Their leader is a brother named Max Sanford, Muhammad Ahmed, and they have some outstanding senior members who have made a major contribution, not only to the Black liberation movement, Black freedom movement, but to the Black arts movement. So I got to meet him years ago. I remember when one of the first connections was when we were preparing for sending a delegation to the 6th Pan-African Congress, and a major influence on him was playing a major role in giving input on the Southern California component, because we represented the Western region to the 6th Pan-African Congress. And so this was the first memory that I have of him. And since then, this brother has been active in a lot of other organizing. He is a founding member of the Malcolm X grassroots movement, which is a very important movement. And he has been involved in the issue of Black political prisoners, as well as advanced scholarship on the Black Panther Party. So his book, We Will Shoot Back, Armed Resistance and the Mississippi Freedom Movement, will be the basis for this discussion today. He has a PhD from Emory University, and you're going to see he has an interesting family background as well. So this is an activist and a scholar, and a really nice brother. I mean, really nice brother. To me, what matters most among our people is the quality of character. And this brother has, he's a great human being. And that's what I like most about you, brother, you know, Akinyele. So I want to welcome you. It's a big honor to have you on this show.
Thank you. It's rare that I'm interviewed by someone who's known me so long, and you have a fantastic memory, because that is where I met you. I believe when we were preparing for Six Pack, I attended one of the gatherings with Mamadou Lumumba. I know it was a couple of, I attended one, I think was either in Oakland or San Francisco. The other one was in Nairobi or East Palo Alto.
Right.
And you chaired both those sessions. So that's when I first observed the great Obata Shaka at that particular time. So I appreciate your memory of me, because I was just about 19 years old at the time, being probably the youngest person in that meeting there, just to learn and take notes. And I learned a lot. That set, some of the things I learned during that period of time set the basis for everything I do now. It's funny, I was listening, viewing some of the previous shows of the Dr. Obata Shaka show, and I thought about how even though we were in different organizations, much of what you espouse is in the same framework format of the philosophy that has grounded me in this movement for the last 4 decades. So much appreciation to you and the elders like you who laid the groundwork for us at that particular time.
Yeah, in both ways. And in your case, we are both into Ifa, which is interesting. And
yes. I was thinking about what you said about character. Ifa said the character is all this requisite. Yeah, so yeah. I was feeling that, and I appreciate you put me in that context.
Yeah, Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, and we were friends. I led the Black Nationalist wing in C.O.R.E. He did in S.N.C.C. And we would often have one conversation that I had with him over and over again. And it was, the key quality of a revolutionary is, first of all, not the principles they adhere to. That's important, but it's their character. I said, that's the key thing. And we'd have little discussions, because I'd point out how many of these characters that were revolutionaries didn't have good characters. And I'm not talking just about Black folks, you know. But a lot of revolutions have failed on the fact that, I don't care how brilliant the leaders were or whatever they were, when it came to character, they just ended up being crummy. And so to me, that's the most important thing. It's the most important thing to our parents. And that's what brings a smile to my face most. And then you've developed some very good young scholars that have followed in your footsteps. So I respect that. Then the other thing is, you and I are probably in a very small category, because you've seen the intro to my show when we're not going live. And I tag myself as the O.R. original revolutionary. Well, I would think of you as a revolutionary scholar, and there aren't too many of those.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And that's unfortunate that we don't have more. I agree.
Exactly.
Yeah.
exactly.
Mhm.
Because I'm not interested in being the one and only of anything.
Mhm.
That's not
No
my
doubt.
thing.
We're not going to win that way.
Yeah, except being the one and only one that tap danced on the heads of my enemy. Now, if I'm the one that did that, fine. But usually to do that, you need help. So
Right. No doubt.
chances are you might be on point, but you can't take credit for that. But that is the one
Right.
only that I would enjoy. You know what I mean?
Right. Right.
And a few
We
that I
can't win
won't
it by
mention,
ourselves.
and a few that I won't mention on this show.
Yes.
Uh,
I hear.
so so this is going to be pure pleasure. And so what I like to do when I start this, because people saw we did a 3-part interview with Dr. Siri McDougall, who's my replacement at San Francisco State, and he has these fine character qualities as well. And so the first thing I'd like to do is to get into your family background.
Mhm.
If you could describe your parents, your great grandparents, first of all, your parents, your great grandparents, and their influence on you.
Man, that's a very African way to begin this program, right? And it, to pay homage to those who came before us. And it's interesting. Some of this family history I learned after We Would Shoot Back came out. After the book came out, my cousin who lives in the Bay Area, Ronald Boone, he's about 10 years older than me. Um, he wrote me and called me after the book came out, and he started talking about our grandfather and my grandfather's brother who lived in Louisiana and northern Louisiana, and how they both had to ultimately leave Louisiana because of their armed confrontation with white folks, and I'm being kind, but white folks in northern Louisiana. And so that kind of surprised me. I didn't know that particular history. Of course, my father told me stories about his father. My father was a sharecropper in the Mississippi Delta. That's where he was born, in a place called Alligator Lake, Mississippi, in Bolivar County. Bolivar County is Black majority county. Has an interesting history because the Garvey movement, UNIA, had thousands of members in Bolivar County during the height of the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association. And it's also the county where Mount Bayou, or all Black town, which kind of represented self-reliance, that was started by a secret society called the Knights of Tabor. But anyway, my father was born there, and one time, and the family saw a Black man's body hanging from a water tower. And so my grandfather was angered and went and got his rifle and was going to shoot the first white person he saw. And the family, my father and the rest of the family, tackled my grandfather and disarmed him, because believing at that particular time that they would have been lynched like the man who was hanging from the water tower if my grandfather had retaliated. Upon hearing that story, and I think I heard it, I was about 13 years old, maybe. Um, it was, I was proud of my grandfather on one level, that he was able to resist, or willing to resist, because growing up in early 1960s, I didn't hear these stories of Black people fighting back, right? Black people resisting. And that's been one of the things that's kind of motivated my scholarship and particularly research around that book, because as I got involved in the movement, I began to hear more and more of these stories of Black people in the South resisting. And, during the period of time I grew up, the image we had in our heads was the Black Panther Party for self-defense, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. But we didn't know these images, that we had a tradition of armed resistance that really birthed, and even prior to them, people like Robert Williams and the Deacons for Defense and others, people like one of your colleagues and comrades in the struggle, C.O. Chin, who birthed this tradition that we knew about during the Black Power era. So that, we have this long history of armed resistance. And really, that goes back to the African continent. And so that's become one of my areas of scholarship that I want to develop and really to leave for youth that come after me. Because I oftentimes think of my consciousness, my awareness when I was, in high school, and how I became motivated in the struggle. And I thought about what literature would motivate me. So that's the type of literature that I want to make available for our youth today, something that would motivate them and carry them to the next generation of our movement.
Anything about your parents and their influence on you?
Well, definitely my parents, both coming out of the South and both being motivated. My mother grew up in Oklahoma. As I mentioned, my grandfather and grandmother were born in northern Louisiana. My maternal grandmother and grandfather. And they left and went to Wewoka, Oklahoma, which interestingly enough is a town founded by Black Seminoles. Um, and my family's not directly Black Seminole, but in the family history on my mother's side, one of my distant ancestors actually fought with the Seminoles in Florida. But they went to Wewoka, Oklahoma. That's where my mother was born. She was a valedictorian at her high school, and she made the choice. She had the opportunity to go to Tuskegee to study to be a nurse, but the rest of her family was moving to Los Angeles, and she decided to move there and became a civil servant. But one of the things she emphasized was education, and that's what influenced me today. I think of my mother actually gave me my first copy of the Black Scholar. And so when I actually produced articles and I served on the advisory board of Black Scholar, I kind of link it to my mother inspiring me during that period of time. My father was, as I mentioned, a sharecropper. He didn't get to go to high school till he was in his late 20s. He left the Mississippi and Arkansas Delta and went to a historically Black high school that had an adult school component called Nashville Christian Institute. And he graduated from Nashville Christian Institute. I think he was nearly 30, and he was one of the first Black people who went to Pepperdine College. So he left there, went to Los Angeles. And so that's how my parents met. When my father left there, went to Pepperdine, was a student at Pepperdine. So both of my parents were very motivated around education and really emphasized that for my siblings and I, And so I kind of credit that. I oftentimes think my father's motivation to have to leave the Delta, to leave picking cotton for other people and seeing other people benefit from his labor, to want to have something different. He became a minister. Interestingly enough, another scholar I've known for decades is Molefi Asante, because Molefi Asante went to the same high school.
Okay.
They went to the same high school as my father. And so when Molefi went to Pepperdine, he lived with the family for a minute.
Okay.
My father was one of Molefi's mentors. So I've known Molefi before he was Molefi Asante, when he was Arthur Smith. And so I used to look up to him back in those days. And so we both look at each other now, how we both transformed from those years in the 1960s to where we are today. Another notable alumni of that high school was Fred Gray, who was the attorney for Rosa Parks, who just turned 90 last week.
Wow.
Produced some great folks, and I'm glad my father is one of their alumni.
Hmm. And as you know, Molefi was a Baptist preacher for some time.
Preacher in the Church of Christ.
Yeah.
So I'm one of the few people in the movement who heard him preach.
Yeah, well, yeah, and he can preach. In
Oh,
fact,
no doubt.
he can out preach King in his style because they both do the sing song gospel style, the second strongest preaching style in the Black preacher tradition. The swoop is the strongest, and the swoop beats singing altogether.
What's the difference between the two?
Well, the swoop is a language, and I don't think you can speak it unless you were raised up under it. And it's kind of like a combination of African linguistics and what we would call Black Ebonics, Niger Congo Bantu speech, but it is a full speech pattern system. You got to be raised in it. And it's interesting that the preachers who preach in that style now, the ones that I know of, Reverend Kevin Cosby, who heads up a 15,000 member church, St. Stephen's Baptist Church, Louisville, Kentucky, minister who was minister of an AME church in Baltimore, Reverend Reed, who's
I
now
know Frank.
bishop. Yeah, he's now bishop.
Right, right.
One of the best read people around, preacher or not. And then the current, the sole bishop in the AME church, who's a sister, she also preaches in this same style. And she's the only preacher I've ever seen that reads her sermons and gets away with it. But it's that linguistic style. So it's the strongest. And then this one that Molefi does, I only heard Molefi once, and he spoke at the African Scholars Conference in Senegal in 2004. Right. He was one of the organizers, and he gave this lyrical speech. I said, I didn't know he had it in him. You know? And to use any other style when you have that style, you're shortchanging people. Right? So yeah, that's wow. Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, you need to do a lecture on that for us. And I heard your show on the blues. You were preaching on there now.
Yeah, that's my heart. You know, our culture is my heart, and
right.
Blues, spiritual blues, man, nothing prettier to me on the planet.
Right on.
I think only Zulu Zosa singing comes close to it. You know what I mean? Zulu Zosa, that's so pretty. Yeah. Well, that's interesting, brother. You know, I have my grandparents on my mother's side.
I thought you were about to bring up a picture.
No, they're both out of Mississippi. My grandmother, Catherine Filardi, and Sylvia Brown. My father comes out of Louisiana and Bunkie, Louisiana, and then worked plantation in Orange, Texas. My father taught himself how to read by reading a newspaper, never went to a day of school, and was one of the smartest people I've ever known.
That's discipline.
Yeah, one of the smartest people, and smart enough to not to go into the military in World War II.
Wow.
Yeah, so this, family background, I think is extremely important. And you obviously got some strong family roots. And I think Black folks, wherever they come from, they got some strong roots here, wherever they are in the world. But I think Mississippi Black people have really faced some real hell, and some of the strongest people we've produced. Not to say that other Blacks aren't strong, Mississippi.
I agree. My spiritual father, who also went to that high school, his name is Metahochi Zanu. In fact, he was one of the first group of people that were initiated at Oyatunji Village. But he went to that high school also. But he would call Mississippi the Holy Land. Same reasons you stated in terms of it being the basis of a lot of our culture. And so I do think it represents something in the psyche of new African people in North America. When we think of, not only the blues tradition, Mississippi, but what the Chicago culture has represented, which is another major branch of our culture in North America. I think it's based on Mississippi, right?
Yeah.
And so I think we got to do some deeper study there in terms of what it represents. I think some of that history I would like to explore that's lost. But I think that, you know, when we talk about what I like to call a Quilombo tradition, I kind of shy away from the term maroon to talk about those rebels amongst our people who resisted in the swamps and the the forest. You know, maroon is based on a Spanish word cimarrones, which means a runaway animal. And I prefer the Bantu term that talks about like a warrior society that we created in resistance on the African continent, particularly in West Central Africa, when our communities were dispersed, and then we reorganized ourselves to begin to fight and to battle. So that Quilombo, I prefer to use that term, but I think there were some that we don't really have that well documented that existed in Mississippi in remote areas that, you know, people call swamp Negroes later. That resistance tradition, I don't think we well documented, and we need to know more about that existed in Mississippi, but in South Carolina, other places too.
Yeah, you know, my great grandmother, Sylvia Brown, um, they called her a wampus cat.
Hmm.
And a few years before my mother passed, we were coming across the Bay Bridge. She didn't know what that meant. I said, what that meant was she could whip a man or anybody else. She was as
Right.
wild as a cat and could whip a man. And she had those qualities. So she was a protector of my mother and her brother, and of course, an enforcer of some pretty serious discipline we all know about. But yeah, that and you know, your point about Chicago. Um, One of the things that I think is really distinctive about Mississippi blacks and other blacks in Chicago is a very strong entrepreneurial tradition.
Mm-hmm.
You got a hell of a business community in Chicago, as well as highly educated
Mm-hmm.
community. Over 25,000 black teachers at one point.
Mm-hmm.
So that educational tradition and that business tradition, I think, has some real roots in Southern Black culture and especially in Mississippi, along with the fighting tradition.
Yeah.
So I think you've got some real important points there. And that's what's one of the things that's always led me to have a lot of respect for Blacks wherever they are, but in Chicago, especially the accomplishments that they have made. And a heavy percentage of those are Mississippi rooted. They're
No
not just
doubt.
from Mississippi, but heavily so. Yeah.
I
And
agree.
under terroristic conditions, some of our strongest people,
Yeah.
and some with some deep pride. My grandmother, who was black as midnight, who loved every inch of herself, um, Mississippi bred. And you could never tell her you couldn't do something. She say, and talking about white people, she said, they'll have to tell me. And she was quiet, soft spoken, and tough. And she would leave white people's homes because she had 2 years of college, but at that time it didn't mean anything for older blacks. They couldn't get any kind of professional job. She would leave cleaning Miss Ann's kitchens or cooking for them to walk in the San Francisco Freedom Movement. You know?
Mm, mm.
And when she was very ill, she asked me, she said, grandson, and I'm the only one in my family she asked, she said, do you think black people will ever rule themselves?
Hmm. She saw something in you.
Yeah, but that
Right.
that she had that. I said,
Right.
oh, that surprised me because a few years earlier I wouldn't have known what she was talking about. But
Right.
once I woke up, yeah, I said, my grandmother, my quiet grandmother. But then I found out when I talked to other family members, she wasn't all that quiet. You know.
Well, my grandmother, who now she's Northern Louisiana, which I think is similar culture.
Mm.
Uh, she said, she told me, I remember when I was a student, college student, and I was sent to interview her for a class project. And I talked to her about her family lineage, and she said, I asked, about the lineage, and she said, I'm an African. And, caught me by surprise because I'm in Pan-African studies and in the Pan-African movement. My grandmother said, I'm an African. She said, I ain't mixed with nothing. And so just to hear her express things in that way, that she's an African and was proud to say she was an African, it just did something to me at, 20 years old, 21, whatever I was, asking her these questions and being a part of the Pan-Africanist movement. But our people, and this is one of the things I love about your scholarship, had this basic Africanism about them without necessarily even when they didn't have the political lexicon that many of us who are nationalists and Pan-Africanists had, that, at the root of the masses of our people, particularly coming from this Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina root, that Africanism is there. And, that's the basis that, as you talk about the blues and our other classical music traditions come from, the way we speak, the way we preach, as you just taught us on, come out of this basic African framework. And, when I would like to build more of my research, I kind of introduce it and we will shoot back. But I think even the way we resist it comes out of this basic African framework. When you talk about, I know you talk about in the integration trap, how there's these basic principles of African culture that we had and we maintain through our enslavement, through Reconstruction, through this period of terrorism and Jim Crow on our people, but then it's assaulted later. I love the argument that we have to make a choice between two cultures, but that basic culture is there, and I think this kept us going thus far. But we can't lose, or we'll be totally disarmed. And genocide. When we talk about genocide, it's not just taking black bodies, as folks say, but it's also about destroying the African mind and destroying the personality and the identity of who we are. And we have to do things intentionally to reinforce that identity. So when I look at you and I see in your office, I see Malcolm, I see Cabral, I see that crown on your head, I see what you're wearing. That's the intentional way of fighting that, but also combining it with this tradition, right? So when I hear you and I hear my other elders talking about a new African culture, that's what we build on the traditions of our traditional past from the continent, but as well as, and my elder, as I talked about before, Metahochi Zano, he said sometimes we have to take our traditions from Africa through the Mississippi mud, right? We have to take it, because that's a part of who we are. And we can't lose that particular part of who we are. We lose a particular strength to be able to fight. My wife is just saying goodbye. She's going to run some errands. So I'm just acknowledging her, acknowledging the house as we move. But no, so that's an important part of not only our past, our history, but where we got to go as we move forward. We can't lose that particular part of who we are.
Yeah, that's an important point. And, your point about, the new African, what I call the new African, the way in which we reforged an African culture here. I have a very good friend, his name is K. Indy Silawazi. and very well read. One of the pictures you see behind me, the dance, that's his painting there. And we both agree on this, that the mass of Black people in this country are nationalists. That is, but I always make this qualification, not ideological. And if you went to the average Black person, they wouldn't know what you're talking about. You're a nationalist. But by that, in reforging this culture, I just mean, well, when we marry, who do we marry? It used to be 97% Black men and Black women married each other. Now it's 93% sisters marry brothers and 86% of brothers marry sisters. That's one of the highest in-rate marriage rates in this country. White people, it's about 88 or 89% total. But ours is based on love. They don't deal with anybody else because they just don't like anybody else and don't like each other too much either. So socially, we're nationalists. And then if you look at the culture, that is what we forged in this country. It's only one of two popular cultures in this country. The popular culture of this country in the world is ours, and it's African-based. Most of us don't know it's African-based, but it's ours. You ain't gonna see us at a country and Western show. I mean, if you get one, poor old Charlie Pride, you know what I mean? Too bad he wasn't masked, beautiful brother. And a guy who was a businessman, who actually the only one hardly Black country singer, who had him a bank, who had him all kinds of stuff, and dropped dead because he's around all these unmasked white people. But the key point is, you're gonna see no Black people at no country thing. You know what I mean? Some might like a little country, but they know where it comes from. So they want the diamond rather than the glass. You know what I mean? So, culturally, we are nationalists. That is, we created the culture. So of course we are. And then spiritually, the same thing. You know what I mean? So the Black church, what is the Black church? And that's a whole nother discussion we won't get into today. But the thing is, it's our creation, and it's fundamentally African. Fundamentally, you know what I mean? Organizations, what do we belong to? They're usually Black. And here's the key thing. I made this on another program. I don't like repeating myself, but this one's worth repeating. An old slave narrative where a former enslaved African said, he used another word, but I'll use this one. He said, only the Blacks can move the Blacks. You can't think of one mass movement that Black people have followed that white people led. Yeah, we gone to war. We voted for presidents that were white, but that ain't no mass movement that we led. You know what I mean? Anything that we're fully behind, we're leading it, because only us can lead us. And Julian Richardson, who owned Marcus Bookstore, his wife just passed. She was about 99, 98 years old when she passed. And both of them were spiritual mothers and fathers to me. I'd probably be dead in the water but for them, not just in terms of knowledge, but when the FBI came after me for work, they always saw I had something, all of that. Julian said, it takes two things to get Black people organized. They got to tap their feet, and you got to get them to think. So you got to have some culture in there that's got some spirit up in it.
Right.
And then it better make sense, because Black people don't do dumb.
Right.
You know what I mean?
That's right.
And that includes, for a lot of us who are revolutionaries, we kind of get out on limbs sometimes, and the grassroots will go, okay, and they'll hide you. They'll give you support, but they'll say, no, what's wrong, to themselves? What's wrong with that boy? Didn't he figure out that wouldn't work? You know what I mean?
Right.
So, we're basically, that's why we're not ideological, because we're more practical. Like Cabral said, people can't eat ideas, and we know ideas are important, but be careful what ideas you're pushing, because sometimes they can get you killed if they ain't accurate, let alone right. And I mean morally right. So, and economics, we know we're weak in this area, but the only people that support Black businesses are Black people, and it's the second largest employer of Black people in this country, next to the government.
I
So,
did
I
not
mean, if
know
you
that.
look at the
That's important.
ground, the fundamental things, that's why Black people are the strongest voting bloc.
Mm-hmm.
That's why, you know
Mm-hmm.
what I mean? And it's not looking at who we're voting for, meaning the color, even when they're Black, like Obama, but it's looking at interests, and
Mm-hmm.
Blacks are looking at interests. And so we don't do dumb. A few of
Right.
us do. A few of us go for Trump.
Right.
Most of us don't do dumb.
Right. No, I
What
agree
do you
with
think
that.
of that?
I was thinking when you said it was about 86% of our people who marry, or our men who marry Black women. Yeah, I was thinking that's about the same percentage of people who voted for Biden. They say Black men voted for Biden. I don't know if
Right,
there's any
right,
correlation, but
exactly,
I'll probably leave that one alone.
exactly. But the difference between the percentage of Black men and Black women who vote, right, is so small it really doesn't matter.
Right.
And if
I
you
agree.
look at that percentage that voted for Biden, that's about the percentage that voted for Obama the second time. Because
Huh.
the first time Black men and Black women was 96% brothers voted for Obama, 97% sisters. But the
Mhm.
second time, brothers had some issues with Obama, righteous issues.
Mhm.
Sisters did too, but the sisters' loyalty to a premier Black man
Right.
occupying the premier position. I know in my house, I wasn't supposed to say nothing about this brother. That was off limits. And you know me, I'm going to be saying some stuff
Right.
and still voting for him.
Right. Right. I hear you. I hear
Yeah,
you. No, I agree.
yeah.
No, I agree with you. Our people are basically nationalists, but not ideological nationalists. But I think that fundamental Black nationalism, I think, still reaches a core. So I remember back in the day, when I say back in the day in the 70s, uh, Queen Mother Moore, we used to bring her to South Central LA, and she would speak to an audience in South Central LA, and there would be some brothers on the side who would, in the back in the day, we would call them winos, playing dominoes. They would stop what they were doing to listen to Queen Mother Moore, because she would hit a tone that kind of, that old street corner Garvey
Right.
tone, and she could preach too. And so, but preach from her standpoint as an elder Black female in our community, and they would feel it, as you said, something gotta make you stomp your feet.
Mm-hmm.
But she also gave them something to think on, but in a cultural framework that they could hear. And
Mm-hmm.
so, they would stop playing dominoes and they would pay attention to Queen Mother more. We would have some other speakers who couldn't quite electrify them or get their attention. They would keep on doing what they were doing. But, I learned from that there was something that Queen Mother Moore possessed that made her be able to speak to, these dry long soul Black folk who were feeling her nationalist message. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so that core is there.
Mm-hmm.
We just have to be able to tap into it. I think I know you've done some things on Black Lives Matter. And so one of the things that I've tried to communicate to some of the younger activists were they need to tap into that tradition also. That even though they bring some new things to organizing and to activism, more to activism than to organizing. And I think that's the key right there, that I know you focused in your writing when you talk about the art of leadership 1 and 2. I remember on one of the volumes, I can't remember which one, Ella Baker is on the cover. And one of the things we have to learn is that organizing tradition, that how do we move as, people who define ourselves as radical or revolutionary? How do we hit the core of our community? And how do we get the core of our community organized and then powerful? One of the young brothers I work with today, he sent me a meme on Instagram, and the meme talked about how the conditions that people are facing now with the economy, with COVID, with all these things going on, can produce a revolution. And I just shot back to him. Conditions alone won't produce a revolution. Organization of the people put us in a position to have one. But if we're not organized, no matter how bad things are, and things have been bad in 2020, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people losing their employment. People are hungry. And then, the government showing unwillingness and inability to provide support for folks during this particular time. But that hasn't mounted a revolution and I think it's because the people aren't organized. And do the radicals amongst us understand that people need more than, it's good to have demonstrations and some disruptive activity, but if people aren't organized, they don't have a sustainable vehicle to take power. And that's, revolutions are about power. And so, this question of organization, I think, is important. And it gets back to what, you talked about in terms of culture, right? Because if you don't understand the culture of the people and don't respect it, how are we going to be able to organize them?
Yeah, that's very important. And I think the point for the viewers that Dr. Akinyele Umoja is making might go over some people's heads, because you might think that, for example, the Black Lives Matter motion, which was very important and I'm very proud of.
No doubt.
50 states, 50 countries, and shifted opinion and everything else. But that was mobilization. Now, it takes organization for mobilization to happen, but a lot of that came out of the fire of the deaths of some brothers and sisters who were murdered visually at a time in which people were undergoing COVID and a bunch of other things. That was a mobilization. Marching is mobilizing. Rallying is mobilizing. Gathering people where we share ideas, that's mobilizing. But organizing is when people actually form structures, and real organizing is when it's at the grassroots level. And very often we miss that kind of organizing. One example is when Harold Washington was elected mayor in Chicago, and there was a great mobilization that put him in there, and he's a great mayor. He was looking after the interests of Black people, as Chokwe Lumumba did in Mississippi. Beautiful brother that I know you knew well, and you did the libation for when he passed on. His son is now mayor. Rarely do we get mayors like that. Mm-hmm. And inside the Black United Front, I pushed at that point. I was National Vice Chair, Conrad Worrell was chair. I said, you have a perfect opportunity to organize now. You think that electing him was organizing. Yeah, it was in terms of campaign work and getting someone into office, but Chicago is basically ethnically organized. And the one group that ain't organized here is Black folks. And we got 600,000 now in Chicago. A lot have left. We've lost 300,000 or 400,000, but still 600,000 Black people, that's a whole lot. And my proposal was, and in the forming of the Black United Front, that was the same proposal, we need block organizing, especially where you have concentrated Blacks, concentrated in particular areas. It was never done. And so when Harold Washington died, Lou Palmer, who had been a key force in circulating a petition, convincing him to run, he said, we made a big mistake. We had him in office, and we should have used that opportunity to organize. And that would be the way you would tackle drugs, gangs. That's the way you tackle economics, the whole 9 yards. Block organizing. And wherever you have concentrations, Ferguson, it's good you got a mayor now, got some people in elective office. Block organizing. Block organizing. The Panthers, when you had the former executive director of SNCC, James Foreman, went to Guinea, came back, recommended to the party, 10-10.
Right.
Block organizing. When are we going to get down to this level? Because, And then that is, and it's not like what the daily machine, it's not a machine. It's got to be grassroots. It can't be used the way the Cubans used it, though it's good for Cuba. It's a resistance system block by block if they're invaded, but it's an eye system where they keep eyes on people. No, for us, it's bottom up. It's the people making decisions, and it's a basis for power. And had the Panthers had this, there'd still be a Black Panther Party, you know. But
And,
this is hard work, this
yes,
kind
sir.
of work. And it's got to be based on people being in charge of running their own stuff. Can't be people on top of them giving them directions and orders.
No, I agree. And that's part of the vision. You mentioned C.O.R.E earlier, part of the vision in Jackson. When he ran for city council in 2009, rather than him just running as an individual candidate in his ward, they organized a people's assembly that included and was open to everybody. And some Black nationalists would say, why would you make it open to anybody? But in a city that's 85% Black, why wouldn't you open it to anybody? And so they built the People's Assembly, which developed his platform, but also when he was elected to city council, gave him direction, and it kept the community organized and in conversation with everybody. When he ran for mayor in 2013, they expanded it citywide, and they still have that vehicle going now that his son, who's mayor now, participates in, and his daughter, Akinyele Umoja, plays as a major organizer to keep the people in the community organized. So for instance, when they discuss policies related to policing, when they discuss policies in terms of or when they discuss developing the city's budget, the People's Assembly meets and people on the grassroots level participate in that conversation. So I know C.O.R.E participated in some of those forums, which in the Black United Front. So he must have took a few notes from that conversation. But yeah, that's the vision there. How do we get our people on the grassroots level mobilized and participating in these conversations? And then that tells us a lot in terms of the folks we do elect. How do they participate? How do they relate to these forms of people's power and these grassroots vehicles of self-determination? How do they relate to these organs of people's power that we create from the ground up, as you mentioned? And that's one example, the Jackson example. We might not relate. I think there were particular conditions in Jackson that allowed for them to create that, but we have to figure out in different places, how can we create this grassroots vehicle? I even think in terms of the reparations movement, that would be a powerful vehicle if we had communities coming and reflecting what is reparations for people in that community. I think that's important. You know, there's been discussion with HR 40 and other legislation about creating a commission, but I think it's different if you have grassroots communities in these dialogues that aid in a commission that provides a commission of wisdom, and not only the wisdom from our communities, and then also builds on that basic grassroots nationalism that you were talking about earlier. It helps to contribute to us organizing that and actually speaking as a nation if we're organized on that level and able to hear from people like your grandmother, you know, hear from these brothers and sisters, like both our grandmothers really, but hearing from their wisdom and getting their participation and having us in dialogue with each other to create a real grassroots Black agenda.
Yeah, you know, that block organizing, we did that in the San Francisco Freedom Movement. After I took over the poverty program in '65, we funneled millions of dollars into the Western Addition. I've never taken any money from organizing, so I put another brother in charge, Will Ussery, who had been chair of C.O.R.E before me. He's 91 years old now, really healthy, looks just like he did in the '60s, just got some little wrinkles around his eyes. He had a little operation. very smart. And his task was to do a block organizing structure in the Fillmore. We organized 45,000 Black people block by block. And we funneled millions of dollars into the Fillmore just for that. And we had every area of the Fillmore organized. And we had a block structure, a neighborhood structure, a district, a regional structure. And, we could pay some organizers, it was top down. But the key thing is that surfaced all kinds of leadership, all kinds of ideas. And it taught me that was the method for organizing,
Well, can I ask you a question there?
Yeah.
A lot of the young organizers, I know that when I say young, people in their early 30s on down, they're connected to nonprofits who are not necessarily based in our communities. And you said you never took a dollar. So how, number one, how do you all finance your struggle? Number two, I'm talking about in terms of the organizers. Number two, what impact do you think having nonprofits who are not necessarily rooted in our communities set our agenda or control our organizers to offer them money or paid positions?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because the movements of the 60s at the local level generally went on their own steam. They didn't get financing for the most part, whether in the South or the North. And it was the national organizations that got funded, In the case of the Black Freedom Movement period, C.O.R.E, Congress of Racial Equality, SNCC in the South, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and King's Group, S.C.C, Southern Christian Leadership Organization, and then other organizations that emerged. Those local movements went generally on their own steam with no money. And what I learned from that is, because we ran a 6-year movement at its high point, 10,000 people, we defeated an entire economic power structure. We're the only Northern movement that actually mastered its reality. We're the only one. And so what I learned from that is you don't need a lot of money to build a movement. What you need is a critical mass. You can need people who are dedicated, and you need a team of people that work well together and bury egos, because to really build a movement, you have to bury egos. And for us, I think we benefited from not having ideology. We were too young to have developed to a point to have even thought through a lot of the more advanced ideas you may come up with later. But even then, when I reached that point, I learned from the movement not to be guided by ideology, but by the situation. Let the situation tell you what needs to happen, and then listen to people. And then out of that, formulate strategies and tactics that work. So on the one hand, it doesn't take a lot of money to make a movement. And if you get too much, that can be a problem, especially if it's coming from big donors. They're going to control what happens. I think what happens with the movement, starting with the poverty program, is that a lot of the movement becomes funded. This is after 65, 66. And while a group like the Black Panther Party might shape its platform in a war on poverty office, they're not funded, when they go out and kick off the Black Panther Party. But what happens is a lot of community groups are now being funded. And what happens with funded groups is, and I think the reason why they've had less overall effect is they have limited missions, because when you get funding, you get funded for a specific objective. And that objective may be very good. You may accomplish a lot, but you're not going to produce general community change, because general community change requires a multifaceted approach. And it requires that you attack the power structure. And you're not going to be able to do that if you're being funded. So I think that's the problem with funded organizations right now. And then it takes out of people the will to fight without money. Now, Black Lives Matter, when it first starts off, it doesn't have funding, but a lot of funding has come in, and I think that I'd like to hear from them what effect that's had on them. Certainly, I think with the George Floyd stuff, that was spontaneous stuff that came at the grassroots level. But then what happens with the organization itself, even before that? So, I think that's the problem, that for groups that are going to really have an impact and systemic change, it's got to be multifaceted. It's got to address whatever the community sees as the major issues. That means you got to engage the community and get it involved in it. And that will usually be unpopular with the people who are doing the funding.
Right.
And it'll take you places where you don't want to go. And
Mhm.
it's going to upset a whole lot of folks, not just the white power elite. It's going to upset the Black power elite. The Black power elite is also going to be aligned against you, as happened with us at certain points. So, that I think is the problem right now, and other problems that you've addressed, that we have to address now. We're in a different set of circumstances. These are hard circumstances to organize under.
No
But
doubt.
I think we need to have a vision of what is organizing, and how can we engage people, and how do we build power. You know? And your point about culture, that's fundamental. Now, in the Black freedom movement, we weren't conscious of this. We were drawing from the culture, and very often we hadn't done an assessment of the culture. We were living it, but we didn't, have an assessment of, well, the culture is this and that. For example, San Francisco freedom movement under my direction used consensus decision making.
Mm-hmm.
All decision making on policy was consensus, not majority vote. That was my decision. And of course, everybody liked it. My reason for doing it was, when you have everybody putting their ideas into the pot, you're going to make fewer mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was my concern, not making mistakes. And but then later on, I find out that's the African method for decision making. Oh,
Right. Right.
it's
Right.
I didn't know.
Right. 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 I always wondered, and we talked about the decades back in the movement. I remember there's a period of time when, in our Pan-Africanist meetings, we would say, okay, what's the African consensus on this? But I didn't know it was rooted intellectually. I didn't know the history of that, and I'm not even sure how did that first get introduced in the Pan-Africanist movement, the 1970s. I think the late 70s. I remember start hearing that we're going to vote on this by African consensus, but it's something to go back and document. Maybe you put a few memories together, we could figure that out.
Yeah, yeah. Yes. So, that those are problems we got now, along with not always having compact communities, a bunch of other stuff. Now, we've gone off the topic,
I
but
know, I know.
it's good. It's good, because this is invaluable discussion that I think people will benefit from,
I do too.
and we can utilize, so
I
I,
certainly benefit from just this the short, brief conversation we've had.
yeah, me too. You know what I mean? Yeah, because the real question is, how do we apply this to change our conditions today and tomorrow?
No doubt.
Change this society, you know? And your point about culture is just very important, because how do we draw from and maintain and even enhance our humanity, which is the essence of our culture?
Right. No, I agree. I agree. These are fundamental questions. I don't know if a lot of conversations are happening on this level, though. I think there's some time to, particularly since this summer we had the great upsurge, right? And it's, at a certain point, it's a time to go back and to reflect so you can move forward.
Mm.
And I think it's important that some of us do that, and then we begin to communicate this. Again, another piece from the integration trap on an intergenerational basis. Because if we don't do that, we're not going to win. I'm always reminded that one of the elements of COINTELPRO in the document, in the memo by J. Edgar Hoover, was to make sure that Black power didn't extend from one generation to the next, that it didn't impact our youth. They wanted to cut that off. And so, we have to recognize and be real intentional that we want to carry these conversations from one generation to the next. That's why I try to, invest in always having younger comrades that I'm learning from as well as sharing with,
Right.
or else, this thing is dead.
Exactly. Intergenerational, because the younger generation has demonstrated some great skill in
No
a
doubt.
lot of areas, in thought, in organizing, in creativity, in art, and culture, all
Yes.
kinds of realms. So, yeah, I mean,
They made me proud.
Me too.
One of the proudest moments I had as I guess, a growing elder in the movement. After Katrina, and I took a bunch of my students to, we were going to Selma, Alabama to be trained so they could go during their spring break to the Gulf Coast and to help people in reconstructing their homes and things of that nature. When we get to Selma, when we get to the venue where the training is supposed to happen, and they were supposed to spend the night, I found out that there was no water. There was no running water at that facility. And I'm thinking, man, I got all these kids with me and they're spoiled. I'm not looking at them like they're comrades. And when they heard the conversation, one young woman, and then she was a student body president at Georgia State at that time, she said, "We're not here on vacation. So just go to the grocery store and buy some water. We'll freshen up and we got to get to work." And I was just so proud to hear her take that response. She took the response of a warrior, right? That they were there for battle, and they, wanted to do what they could to prepare themselves in battle. They didn't need a lot of creature comforts. And so, it taught me a lesson that I had to begin to appreciate them as comrades in this struggle, and just share with them and teach them some of my experiences and challenge them at times. Sometimes they needed to be challenged, but I didn't need to look at them as babies.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Yeah, exactly.
we got to carry this thing from one generation to the next.
Yeah, it's a long distance run. It's not a 50-yard dash. It's a relay.
Which is why we both still here.
Uh, now, getting into some of the topic that we had for today, I think my question would be, because today what we wanted to do, in drawing from your book on We Will Shoot Back, Armed Resistance in the Mississippi Freedom Movement, today we wanted to look at the African influence on resistance traditions, armed resistance traditions in the US particularly. And so what I wanted to start with was a question that John Henry Clark, he often made this comment that large African nation states got heavily hit by Islamic attacks. And those Islamic attacks created a set of circumstances that then influenced how African nations responded to the enslavement and colonial system coming later from the European. You want to comment on that?
I that I greatly think of Akinyele Umoja's 2000 Seasons when I hear that point. For those who haven't read that book, it's a novel. I would suggest you read it, and don't just take it as fiction. Umoja was from royal lineage in Ghana, and much of the stories, particularly in his two novels, 2000 Seasons and The Healers, is based upon the oral tradition he heard from his elders in the community. And when he tells a story in 2000 Seasons of a people in West Africa, I think of the mother principle when we talk about this, but in the early part of the book, the community is living under pretty much a strong, he calls it the rule of the women, right? The rule of women in this community. And it was a society that was pretty much, as Cabral called, horizontal. And they are attacked by what he calls the people of the desert. And I think that's a metaphor for Islamic warriors, Islamic invaders, I should say. Now, I position that historically as historically the Amaravids, who were North African Muslims, attacked people in ancient Ghana, the ancient kingdom of Ghana, dispersed that community, which was around, I believe, where Senegal is today. And they went deeper into Africa. Some people suggest this is the origin of the Akan speaking people in the area that the British colonialists were called the Gold Coast. And they reestablished their order. Now, what connected with what Dr. Clarke was saying, in 2000 seasons, these communities moved from being more horizontal to more hierarchical and more male-dominated rule, a monarchy that moves away from maybe more consensus-oriented government to because they feel after the attack that they come from the people from the north, the people who were really more Islamic, the people of the desert, as Armand talks about in the book, they become more militarized and more hierarchical and more male dominant in their society. And so this is what leads to that development amongst us. We become more militarized, but then internally we may lose some of more of what we would call the African democracy that roots back to our parent people, the Twa people, as talked about in some of your work, and the mother principle, and the integration trap. Like I told the audience when we started, we kind of come from the same root, and so I've studied and integrated much of your contributions into my historical analysis, and so that's how I would see it, and that's how I would connect with what Dr. Clarke offered us. In Mali, I think is a little bit different. Mali is a later development. I see Mali. I think you see Sunjata rise as the emperor of Mali, but it's within the context of what had been stated earlier, right? And he's certainly a military leader. He's raised in the warrior tradition. It's interesting. I heard Amar also speak on Sunjata, and he said Sunjata is much in the tradition of when we talk about Heru in the Kemetic tradition. How Heru had been, for those of you who know this history of Asar, Aset, and Heru, they come out of Kemetic tradition, where Asar is the father of civilization, right? And he gets displaced by his brother Seth. And then his son Heru comes and emerges to defend his father's honor, and also to restore balance in the universe, which is a cycle, right? To try to establish battle on a cosmological level. And I'm sorry for people if you're not following me on this. Maybe Obata can help me tease it out. But Sunjata, who's the founder of the Mali Empire, follows in that tradition. He and his family, his mother, are displaced from their place in society. And Sunjata, who also had physical disabilities, emerges to reestablish order in that particular place and build the Mali Empire, and becomes the leader of that. So Armand put that in perspective for me also, and how that connects to our story of Sunjata, which is one of our most important oral traditions coming out of West Africa. Also fits into a same paradigm as S.R.E, Set, and Heru. I
Yeah,
hope that wasn't too intellectual of
well,
of an answer.
there's nothing wrong with being intellectual.
Yes, sir.
In fact, one of the things that slavery did was do in our historical memory. So we've had to restore it. And that means going back and getting some good records. Armagh is a good one. That's an interesting way you're looking at it, that when the Almoravids hit Ghana, ancient Ghana, um, you see that as forcing Africans to go into a militaristic, more of a centralized kind of thing. And it's interesting because the kind of systems that Armagh was referring to were those classless age grade societies that didn't have kings and queens. They were the first to form in Africa after hunter gatherer was the first stage, and they were the most just societies. And they continued afterwards as well and get preyed upon through the enslaved system by better organized Africans as well as European and Arab enslavers, because they don't have the military systems to resist as well. So the Igbo come out of that as well as many others.
Right.
And most of our historians have not studied these classless age grade societies that have kings and queens.
Right.
They're the most just. So
Right.
I find your analysis interesting. I mean, that's an interesting point. And a real important point, Obinga and I, we've talked about this. Pre-colonial African societies did not have standing armies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think about that too when you talk about the Igbo, because some of what we know about the Igbo was from Equiano's writings, right? And Equiano described his community as, they definitely have a military tradition, but it's more of what he described as a militia.
Right.
And so his siblings, and when I say siblings, not just his brothers, but the women, the females were involved in his military tradition. He talks about how even his sister, his mother, are involved in training through the weapons they have at the time and preparing for invaders on their community. So, but he describes it as a militia, as you said, not as a standing army. Now, I think that some groups in the 18th century did have standing armies, if I'm not mistaken. For instance, we talked about that. You and I talked about yesterday, Segu in amongst the what I call the Bamana people. The French call them the Bambara people, but Segu was an age grade system. Did have an age grade system, but Bitten Kalabari, who emerged as a leader, organized his age grade into a standing army, and they were able to get organize themselves as such where they were able to monopolize power within society. So I think there were some, particularly as you began to have because of the Middle Passage, the threat of invaders, not only internal to Africa, but from the chaos that was created by the Europeans. I kind of see the chaos that was created by the Europeans is through the commodities that they were able to put into the economy. It created an imbalance where certain sectors of internal to African society had power or wealth, and they emerged that disrupted the internal democracy that we had already established. And so some monarchs, because that's who they're primarily dealing with, right, is the monarchs in society, not the council of elders. And which is why, and I'm not sure if I got this from Walter Rodney or not, and from Europe, how Europe underdeveloped Africa, but they had more, when I say the European slavers had more influence with societies that were more becoming more hierarchical, and they could develop those relationships with African monarchs. Then in turn, those African monarchs, because of their increased wealth, were able to neutralize the checks and balances that African systems, particularly Council of Elders, other council of people who represented lineages, they could, because of the imbalance that was created, they could neutralize the check that more democratic structures within Africa would have on them. And then, it gives back to what you were saying earlier about this consensus piece. Where does it come from? And how this imbalance in that consensus, leads to where we're at today, in a way. So.
Yeah, and based on the items that you're saying that are being brought in, trinkets and goods and guns and bullets.
And alcohol.
And alcohol, it brings in the emergence of new groups, and one of them are these slave traders, the African ones, who accumulate power sometimes greater than kings.
I agree.
And they are now in a new form. Some of them are leading Africa today.
Right. No,
new form.
I agree.
They're not the ones engaging directly in the slave trade, but they are the successors, and they're behaving in pretty much the same way. And terrible.
Yes, beginning of a tradition, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's been dangerous for our people overall. I think that's something that has to be studied a little bit deeper too, and maybe some reason why. I know when I went to Ghana in 2004, and I know they were dealing with the Middle Passage. Some people were dealing with it as a commercial venture, but but it wasn't. And I have to give credit to James Smalls and Leonard Jeffries on this. I think they kind of pressured the Ghanaian government to include the history of what happened to us in their local curriculum. That wasn't happening before, and I think there might be some connection between those who emerged in power, who are still in power, as you said, with this responsibility that they have to the rest of us who are in the diaspora, those of us who were taken in the Middle Passage. I really respect that Benin is the first state in West Africa to recognize this and to even take some responsibility for this. And I think that's something that we have to recognize and to encourage its development, because I think it will lead to a stronger Pan-Africanism.
Yeah, and Ghana has some real strong traditions around male-female governance that at the traditional level still persist.
Right.
It's unfortunate that couldn't be translated to the national level as Ghana moved to independence. This is one of John Henry Clark's critiques. He saw as great as Nkrumah was, it would have been much better had he been able to draw more from the traditional knowledge that some of his rivals possessed, but that the people possessed.
Right.
And incorporate that into his visions around African unity, but rebuilding Ghana and rebuilding African nations. And so, yeah, I think because I've been in the traditional villages and observed how decisions are made, and people have still much more input at that local level, at that village level, than they do at the national level, and that is where the decisions get made now in Africa, or usually in the hands of very few people. And usually outside of Africa, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and major corporations. They're dictating terms, and Africa's delivering resources now also to China, and living in poverty, over 1 billion people that should be extremely prosperous right now. So
That would have made it a real African revolution.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, and
exactly.
I think I don't think at my visit there, I don't think Nkrumah was 100% lost on it, but because I remember I met and this brother who he had appointed uh, to study herbs, traditional medicines of the Ghanaian people. But it had to move. It should have looked at, well, how do we look at our political structures, as you said, as you stated, and how can the traditional political structures be developed as opposed to relying on the um, political organs and forms that were established by our colonial oppressors, right? Just modeling them. I'm always blown away when I look at a court in Africa on the continent, where Black Africans are, and
Man, wigs.
rather than seeing a judge dressed like you, seeing a judge with a white wig on his on his head, in a room that doesn't have any air conditioning.
Uh, which
So
means,
I would much rather see a judge dressed like Dr. Overton Shaka.
or you.
Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
yeah, which means you're going to get some wigged out justice. And it's going to be white on the outside and white on the inside.
Right.
Have you read Basil Davidson's work, Curse of the Nation State?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a Nigerian that's written a similar work, and basically his argument, and I think he's correct, is that one of the biggest curses that Africa faced at independence was inheriting the European nation state model.
Right.
And that
That's not
model,
George Ayeti, is it?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I use that in my classes.
Mhm.
When I teach African political thought, we start with that.
Yeah.
Excuse me, when I teach African American political thought, because based on the same orientation I received as a young person in the movement, we got to start with the continent. We can't just assume that our ancestors, like a Ella Baker, wasn't influenced by this perspective, right? Coming
Right.
from our ancestors. So it is important to start with the continent. So we discussed African forms of governance and politics even before we get to Martin Delany
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Marcus Garvey.
Yeah. Because Delany and particularly Garvey, they had not really, even though Garvey, I was reading some of his stuff, he had gone to the British Library and had read Africa Life and Customs by Blyden.
I didn't know that.
And that's Blyden's best work.
Yes, sir. Yes,
But
sir.
I don't think that he had internalized that in terms of seeing that as a model for how you govern.
Right.
That clearly
Right.
was a model. And so
Right.
this idea that the Western European system for governance is what Africans inherit in independence and don't question it, particularly the leaders. And so that system is basically, just to simplify it for people that may not get it, it's based on the John Locke Second Treatise of Government. And to break it down, what is that? John Locke was leading political scientist that influenced this whole idea of how Republican government worked in Europe, France, Britain, later Germany, United States. The United States adhered to his ideas better than Britain because his two treaties of government, second treaties, has no king or queen in it. But the key point is, he says the role of government, and this is not a democracy, it's a republic where you vote for people to represent you in office. The role of government is to protect property. And particularly, he's not talking about your house. He's talking property.
Right.
At his time, it was not at the level it is now, but it was big property. And it's now much bigger. And so Africa comes out of a communal sharing system where no one owns the air, land, or water. So if you set up governments that are designed to protect an institution that's foreign to African conceptions, then what you're doing is you're setting up a system designed for robbing the people, stripping them of wealth and impoverishing them, and basically having government that will protect the interests of big business that comes from abroad. And that is basically the problem with the European nation state model in Africa. And one of Africa's most perceptive leaders was Julius Nyerere.
Right.
I worked in those villages. Our organization did, Pan-African People's Organization, for 3 months in 73, met him in 77. We took part in the 6th Pan-African Congress. He was a great leader, and he had good ideas on how to rebuild Africa.
Right.
And they were frustrated by his own elite and by international forces. Those ideas were working, building villages where you had housing, education, medical care, all at the village level. But his own brainwashed elite frustrated this along with international forces. But one thing that Nyerere didn't get, and he got more things right than I think any other African independence leader, because he didn't go to Western education until he was 12 years old. So he was basically oriented around African traditions. And so Ujamaa, sharing through the family, was just his idea of communalism, how it worked in the modern setting. But he admitted that he had never questioned the European nation state model, never questioned it, and didn't see the value of questioning it at the time he was being questioned a few years before he died. And so, and this is a well-intentioned brother who did good work and was frustrated not through his own mistakes, but that European nation state model is what did him in, because the people around him who he depended upon, I met Nyerere in 77, and he said, and my most important meetings, I never take notes on them, I remember them. Garvey was my most important influence, and I never took a note on Garvey, and I got volumes that I read because he's in me. I remember every word that Nyerere said. And he said, we could have run this country with European help, but I wanted Africans to be running their own country. Unfortunately, they didn't have his mentality. Europeans wouldn't have either. And so as a result, using that European nation state model, they were in a position to frustrate the decisions of the people that knew best, who were the Wananchi, that's a Tanzanian, that's a Swahili word for grassroots, who were the people that knew how to build the kind of nation they needed then, an agricultural nation that could then move to high tech later. And they were prepared for that. They were frustrated by the European nation state model. And now you've got a president of Tanzania that is an absolute dictator. And it's the first one that Tanzania's ever had, because Nyerere passed on a good system of African leadership. This guy here is terrorizing anybody that comes close to trying to unseat him, and gets elected by such large majorities that Jesus couldn't have got elected by, from Muhammad or God. If God came down and ran for office, there might be somebody that voted against even God. This guy doesn't get any votes against him. So that's by way of saying that in terms of Africa, these old traditions, some of those really work because we didn't have poverty.
Right.
Oppression of women.
Right.
Oppression of children. You know what
Prisons.
I mean? Huh?
Prisons.
No prisons. Yeah, none at all. There was capital punishment. Now, Africans are pretty serious on a couple of things. Stealing was one and murder was the other.
Right.
Stealing was almost at a higher level because of a crime, because if you stole in a society there was no reason to steal, then that was really something that people just couldn't quite understand. Your head might go off on that one. You know what I mean? Right. That was about the only time. So yeah, you know, this disruption of Africa, a lot of us think, oh, we can't, there's nothing we can do about it. Well, guess what? As John Henry Clark said, our villages are still pretty much held together in Africa by a lot of these traditional systems.
Right. No, no doubt, no doubt. But they call this Western democracy, so-called democracy, they call it civilization. Amazing.
As some would say, isn't that an interesting idea?
Right.
Civilization, at least among white people, you know.
Yeah.
In terms of the kinds of military resistance to European and Arab incursions during this period, can you give some prominent examples of African military resistance describing some of the warrior strategies and philosophies and tactics adopted at that time?
Cool. Rob, I'm gonna have to take a break for a second.
Okay.
All right. I'm sorry. Be right back.
Okay. Well, I'll fill in while our brother is taking a break. I don't need much imagination to figure out what kind of break that is. In terms of this period that we're discussing right now, Africans are facing incursion that is coming from Europe. There had been an earlier Arab slave trade that had operated prior to that, that opened the way for the European slave trade. The question I had asked Dr. Akinyele Umoja earlier was a John Henry Clark question of, when the Arab invasions came in and hit nations like Ghana and Mali, what kind of impact did it have on Africa's ability to resist European enslavement later? And the key point is the biggest impact it had was that those attacked by the Almoravids and others coming from North Africa, they knocked off, destroyed the biggest nation states that would have provided resistance to European incursions later on. And that is the biggest impact and effect of the Arab presence before. It softened Africa up for what would become the attacks coming from Europe later. Because prior to that attack, Africans could actually field armies larger than European armies. The Ghanaian army could actually outfield the European army, yet they had no desire to conquer. So this was a major impact. Now, going back, Akinyele, to the question of African military resistance to European and Arab incursions during this period, can you give some examples of prominent examples of African military resistance during the 18th and 19th century, a few, and some of the strategies and tactics they employed?
Well, one of the ones I mentioned earlier, and that was when we talk about this tradition of quilombos. A lot of us think because that name or that word quilombo was used in Brazil for the reconstituted, or the for lack of a better term, the maroon communities that were used in Brazil, particularly with the strongest one being Palmares, that in the 17th century had formed a new African nation in Brazil. I think the word begins in Brazil, but it's a term that comes from what we now today call Angola, where when European slavers came into Angola, and it was one of the only places on the west coast of Africa where you might have had a military presence of Portuguese or Europeans. But when those communities were disrupted, then African people reconstitute themselves into warrior societies they call quilombos. And so one of my big brothers in the struggle, Geronimo Pratt, renamed himself after those people. The Jaga people was one of those communities that formed quilombos to resist against European, particularly the Portuguese slavers. It's interesting that Queen Nzinga, when she formed her queendom called Matamba that resisted European slavers for decades. She, as a part of a military alliance, married one of the chiefs of the Jaga people. But Geronimo named himself after them as Jaga, Geronimo of the Jaga people. But that was one of the things, one of the forms of resistance. And that wasn't the only place. In other places, we had Africans who not only reconstituted themselves, but in amongst the Baga people of Sierra Leone, you had the leader Tamba, who called for a united front. You know, you say that you were the vice chairman of the National Black United Front. Well, Tamba in the 18th century called for a united front of his people to resist against, Africans who had aligned themselves with the slave traders. And West Africa, that was more of the tactic of Europeans. A lot of people get it twisted thinking that Europeans at that time, the 18th and 19th century, had a superior military might to Africans, but that's not true. In some cases, we were more advanced in terms of our martial traditions to be able to resist and fight against Europeans. But it was basically their divide and conquer tactics and their corruption of many of our leaders that gave them the advantage to benefit over us or gain the advantage over us during this period of time that, led to millions of our people being in the Western Hemisphere. Another thing I want to mention, and this is still even in during our lifetimes, a major element of African warfare, traditional African warfare, is spirituality was always an important component. And so even when we study the resistance in Zimbabwe in 1970s and 80s, traditional spirituality was an important element of being able to resist. So when we think of, we hear of the great female priestess Nahanda, who led people in what they call Shimarangas to resist the white settlers in Zimbabwe or Rhodesia. Her lineal descendant fought or traveled along with soldiers who were connected to Robert Mugabe, and she did spiritual work on the battlefield to help protect African guerrilla warriors who were part of the Zimbabwe African National Union. And several places throughout South Africa, West Africa, where we had military engagement, traditional priests were important in order to help provide people protection on the battlefield, confidence on the battlefield, and to engage their enemies. So that's one form of traditional warfare. How did that translate to the United States? One example is the Stono Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina, when African people, led by a brother from Angola, I believe his name was Jimmy, organized his comrades in struggle. And many of the enslaved Africans were from Angola who were part of his team of rebels. And white observers of their resistance talked about how Africans began to drum and dance in the ring shout in a counterclockwise motion as they prepared themselves to engage in battle. And so this connection, this spiritual connection to warfare was something that our ancestors did at that particular time in the 18th, 19th century in Africa, as well as here in North America and other parts of the Western Hemisphere. Spirituality, and so when we think about that and relying on those traditions, today, spirituality needs to be an important part of what we do in our movement. as we build. We have to do it in a way that respects the variety of faiths amongst our people, variety of religions amongst our people, but at the same time, I think we have to rely on a basic spirituality to move us toward victory, to give us confidence, and to bring us together as a people.
Yeah, most African warfare, one example you gave earlier was Sunjata. Um, most African warfare included both the physical battle and the spirit battle. And in the case of Sunjata, when he's fighting Samanguru, who was the oppressor of the Malian people, he was a traditionalist, by the way. Sunjata has been pictured as a Muslim, but at best a nominal Muslim, because he was a traditionalist as well.
Right.
And he drew on traditional powers.
Right.
So in the account that's given of the battles, as much emphasis is placed on the strategies as on the magic. And so for African people, having some kind of magical force there has always been important. And for Native Americans, the same thing. Crazy Horse, and greatest warriors among the Lakota people, he's called Crazy Horse because he had a dream where he saw this horse that behaved in a crazy fashion. And it prescribed medicine, meaning certain things he had to do to protect himself before he battled.
Exactly.
And as long as he did that, he would be victorious. But one time, a battle was called on for him to take part in so quickly, he couldn't do the preparation and died. So Africans and Native Americans and most people of color believe that these two go together. Now, I believe in praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. So you ain't winning unless you can make your enemy holy in some kind of way, if you know what I mean. And I'm not talking about real holy people. Use your imagination.
Right.
So prayers is good, but you better have something to back those prayers up.
No doubt. No doubt.
Um,
Faith without works is dead.
Yeah. Now, just to narrow down, in examining slave rebellions that occurred here in this country, can you see some influences of African warrior traditions carrying over? You gave one with the Stono Rebellion.
True of Stono, true of when we think about the 1712 rebellion in New York. Oftentimes we don't think about our captivity being in New York, but they relied on traditions that came from the Akan. The great book on this is by a former student of mine, believe it or not, Walter Rucker, who's now at Emory University. I taught him when he was at Morehouse, an undergraduate student, but he wrote a book called The River Returns, and it looks at these African traditions that were involved in the rebellion in New York. So it looks at African traditions that were involved in Gabriel Prosser's movement. Many of Gabriel Prosser's people were Igbo. In that Virginia area, many of the enslaved Africans were from the Igbo region. He talked about their inspiration and use of water spirits and involving them in the struggle, and as well as that Gabriel was a blacksmith, and the blacksmith tradition in warfare, as well as when we look at Denmark Vesey's uprising. Of course, he had the conjurer, the root man, Gullah Jack, who it's debated whether he was from West Central Africa or whether he was from the Mende people. But Gullah Jack was the root man, and Gullah Jack used not only his forms of divination and things of that nature, but one of the things about Denmark Vesey's folk is they took a death oath, which is an important thing that in African men's society and warrior societies, was to take this oath, a thing that was carried out even by people like Bunchy Carter and others, or even the Deacons of Defense taking this oath. That's one of the things I found when I interviewed many of the older deacons, is they took this oath, and it's one of the reasons I think that motivated or didn't allow the deacons to have a lot of infiltration, because their reliance on a more secret society type of tradition that goes back to our African warrior traditions also. Uh, so yes, I think some of these things carried over and were passed on. Of course, one of the things one of the forms of, not form of African resistance, I really want to say one of the examples of African resistance is the 1811 uprising in Louisiana, that if it was successful would have took New Orleans, took the armory in New Orleans, and liberated Africans on both sides of the Mississippi River, led by a brother by the name of Charles Deslone. As folks marched in that particular uprising, and it started with 100 Africans, and it led to at least 500 as a part of their army that marched along River Road from outlying parishes leading to New Orleans. And they captured, I think, 25 miles of land, but they had drummers, you know, that motivated the people in their formation and inspired the warriors, utilizing the African drum. So when we, a lot of times we're told in our history that one of the reasons we don't have the drum here was Europeans feared the drum. Well, they had reason to fear the drum because it was an important part of our warrior tradition to, keep our people marching in formation, and also to call upon the ancestors to provide that protection. In African warfare, music, drumming, and dance were used for protection, but also the simple things as they might be instructed to eat certain things or to stay away from certain things in terms of providing them protection. Well, some of these things were employed in that Louisiana uprising of 1811. Unfortunately, that was something that was celebrated in the 90s, early 2000s in New Orleans, until Katrina happened and disrupted that tradition. When I say it was celebrated, they would have marching bands, they would have essay contests celebrating this slave revolt, which I thought was a great event to transmit that consciousness from one generation to the other and embrace our history. And hopefully we can rebuild that again.
I'd never heard of it's a death oath. Could you describe that a little?
Yeah, it was like an oath. You probably done one yourself, where you're in a pack of brothers, in particular a brotherhood, and you have an oath that you're gonna not only fight to your death, but you won't reveal anything that's any secrets of this brotherhood that you're a part of. And this was employed. A lot of people in the 60s called it a Mau oath. So I know Bunchy Carter and his group and the Black Panther Party in Los Angeles did it, particularly the military wing of his organization. But the Deacons for Defense did something similar in Louisiana and in Mississippi, that they took that oath, and it would be a pact. And I think it contributed to, unlike the Panthers, I think the Deacons, when you look at their COINTEL profiles, you don't see a lot of informers. We know in the Black Panther Party, we saw a whole lot of informers, right? But in the Deacons for Defense, we did not see informers. In fact, the Deacons I interviewed, they told me if they revealed any secrets of the organization, that they were going to die. And not just because somebody mystically would do it, but they knew the organization would handle that. Like you said, that there are some ways where Africans believe in capital punishment too. So, and that would have been one at that particular time in the Deacons, would be snitching.
For people that don't know, and Dr. Akinyele Umoja, when he gets into the second part, he'll be dealing with the Black freedom movement in Mississippi, Black freedom, Black power, and armed resistance traditions. He'll go into this in detail. But the Deacons for Self-Defense was an armed self-defense group coming out of Bogalusa, Louisiana. And a guy named Ernest Thomas, known as Chili Willie, who I knew personally, who was a West Coast representative to Congress of Racial Equality. They were deacons coming out of the church, and they were self-defense arm to protect the Black community, but they also served as a protective arm for civil rights demonstrations, particularly C.O.R.E demonstrations. I led some in Bogalusa, Louisiana in '65. The deacons were on the side with shotguns. I was carrying a .38 Smith & Wesson Bank of America nickel-plated special.
And that's what some people don't understand. I mean, you're part of C.O.R.E, which is committed to nonviolence, but many C.O.R.E organizers like yourself were armed in the South.
Yeah, and my girlfriend had brought this Virginia Burton, who's passed on. She was chair of Berkeley C.O.R.E, and she drove all the way from Berkeley to see that her man was armed. And I was laying in a Freedom House with the deacons, expecting the Klan to come, and they were giving me the history of the deacons. I'll share that later. But I would say that one of the reasons that the deacons didn't have informers, in addition to the death oath, was that Black culture in the South is a whole lot more solid than, and particularly with some of these street cats who had warrior tendencies, but gangster tendencies competing, and you need to work on their heads and all the rest of this stuff and money issues and all kinds of stuff. And coming out of a Southern base, rural Southern's usually the best, but a Southern base, there's a moral integrity that people have. You know what I mean? And I think that along with the oath and everything else, they just more African.
I agree. And I think relationship is important. And so the people I talked to who were in the deacons in Mississippi, they talked about how to join the deacons, they had to know you. And
Exactly.
you grew up in a community together. They might have played football, or they were part of the same lodge, part of the same church. And so that's who was recruited in, because this, I know this person. We have a relationship, we have a bond. And so it's not the same as just recruiting somebody off the street. I think we do need forms of organization for people who come off the street, but we do need to have those relationships built up over a period of time for the certain forms of organization that we need in our community. And we need a variety of different organizations, I think, for us to win.
Yeah. In the case of San Francisco C.O.R.E, we were not barely penetrated. We had such a diverse movement that the cops, Black cops, would inform me. I was the only person they would tell. My members didn't know this. When we were infiltrated, they would come to me and tell me, "You're infiltrated." They wouldn't tell me who. And then I'd set up traps. And I've never told anybody in the group who the people were that I found out either, because I'd leave them in the group and then just play with them. But the key point is the members, we had 100 hardcore members.
Right.
They had integrity.
Right.
You know what I mean? DC came out of Donald Cox, out of San Francisco C.O.R.E. And Benny Stewart, who was chair of the Black Student Union during the strike, describes him as the best Panther. And I was talking to Raymond Wimbush. Do you know Raymond Wimbush?
Yeah. Raymond
was going with Kathleen Cleaver for a long time after the Eldridge Cleaver thing.
I did not know that.
There's a whole lot of that I won't go into, but the key thing is the point that he made was that she was talking about what a great person he was, Donald Cox. UCLA student, he didn't graduate. That was his choice. Very smart, very humble, very quiet. He was a ladies' man. Ladies liked him. You go look at him, you see why, but a nice human being. But the point is, our chapter had that quality.
Right.
All different types. We had 2 people, one a PhD in space technology, and then another with the PhD in speech pathology. And then we had people who couldn't read and write. You know, we had every kind of Donald, jazz musician, John Handy,
Oh yeah,
also
yeah,
a
yeah, yeah.
boxer. He's
Hmm.
an ex-boxer and only has one eye.
I didn't know
He
that.
boxed. He only had one eye.
Huh. I didn't know he was a boxer either.
Yeah, and he lives about 10 minutes from me. And right now I'm getting ready. When I'm finished my sixth book, I'm going to write a book on San Francisco C.O.R.E because that was the best organizing I did. And by all means, it initiated me, woke me up the whole 9 yards. But like he was a key activist in the movement. John Handy, you know what I mean? John Handy, who played a song, it was hard work, a million record seller, 11-time performer, the Monterey Jazz Festival, and
Mm-hmm.
considered the best jazz performer to perform there, and who has a degree in music, who can lay out a orchestra thing for 100 players. You know what I mean? That's how good he is in music. But the point is, in C.O.R.E, he was one of the most active people, got arrested more than most people. You know what I mean? But the point is, in an urban setting, and these were a bunch of people that didn't know each other, we formed a bond.
Right,
And the bond was our people came first.
right.
And everybody had gifts, and nobody got suppressed, and nobody got hurt either. You know what I mean? So that can work in an urban environment too, if the leadership has good character and if people are treated right. You know what I mean? And let the agents come in. You can handle them. But
I,
if you haven't got your foundation right, if the leadership's got issues, then everything else is going to be a mess. You know, so
I think one of the challenges today is, particularly like in this COVID virtual environment, is how do we build those same type of relationships? Uh, and so that's the challenge for us today. I think we're going to have to figure that out. And then, this generation of young activists have to figure, how do you develop those relationships where you can speak to somebody's character, um, and you only deal with them virtually. Um, Hopefully when we get out of this COVID, we'll do more, folks will do more of that. But I was even challenging folk around that before we got in this period, to just do knowing people through Facebook and Instagram and Twitter is not, no, not really building a relationship. Do we have to have, build real bonds of trust that you
yeah,
could do, which I only know you could do face to face and really knowing and interacting with people, but that's something we have to consider.
yeah, that is true. That
Mm.
is true. Because in the end, you got to touch people or know them and everything, see their eyes,
Right. I agree. I agree.
hear that voice tone. You know what I mean?
Right. 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 No, I hear you.
And get into their homes
Right.
and see
Right.
what actually is going on there. You know what I mean?
And when we were younger, where their mama live?
Exactly. Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
what's their family? Most of my folks I'm still with from the 1960s, they know my mother.
Hmm.
Or from 1970s, I should say. Yeah, they know my mother. My mother knows them.
Hmm.
She
Oh
knows
yeah.
who to call on. So we become family. We become to develop a real bond then. So we really call somebody a comrade. That relationship has to be on that level.
Yeah, exactly. And ultimately, it's a level of love.
Right.
You'll give that person anything. You know?
And even later arrivals like Sister Haiba, who worked with you and Papa, who now lives here. I know her children.
Hmm.
Right. I know her mother, so it's, you know, I really know them. It's not just somebody I've tweeted with.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Finally, we're wrapping up. I wanted to pull something out of your book. You had a important discussion, and we will shoot back. You discussed certain warrior traditions that persist in Black communities, and I'm not going to use the term we usually use, but the bad black, the
Yeah,
bad Negro tradition.
right. What
Uh,
of somebody you know
uh-huh.
or
Uh,
knew?
yeah, and I liked how you wove that into your discussion of the Black resistance movements in Mississippi. But can you give some examples of how that's manifested today?
Oh man, how it manifests today. I think first let me, for your audience, describe what I meant in the past. During a period of time, particularly of segregation, the term they would use, I'll use a more sanitized word, is a bad Negro or crazy Negro. There were some black folks who challenged the rules of segregation. Um, if they told them they couldn't look a white man in the eye, they might look a white man in the eye. If they told them they had to cross the street, they might not cross the street for a white, if a white man's right walking on that side of the street. The person I mentioned who Obata Shaka knew, Dr. Obata Shaka knew, was a man in Canton, Mississippi by the name of C.O. Chin. He was the bad Negro in that community. And he developed a reputation, from what I'm told. What he told me was when his family were black landowners, meaning that he didn't have to work for white folk. They owned, like 250 acres of land. And so during the week, he would be dressed in his dress clothes, and not in a type of dress that would assume that he's working on a white man's plantation. A white man went and talked to his mother and said, look, CO needs to either, get a job, work for somebody, or, he doesn't need to dress like that during the week. When she mentioned that to CO, he went and confronted the white man and told him, look, if he talked to his mother again like that, either the white man was going to be dead or CO was going to be dead. People in the community just said, that Negro is crazy. And so they decided, white folks left CO alone because they didn't know what he would do. CO is just one example of that. Even if you look at our, as you know, our blues tradition sung about black people like that, and that wasn't just folklore. There were black people who white folks just knew, okay, we're going to leave him alone. We're going to give him his space because they didn't know what type of consequences. Talk about and we will shoot back. There were some black people who did resist, some who were killed and lynched by white folks, but people who resisted, who in the oral tradition of our community developed legendary status. One brother in the Mississippi Delta, Joe Pullen, who they had to bring forth, dozens of white people to subdue him, and they finally set him on fire. Fannie Lou Hamer would talk about him and hearing the stories of Joe Pullen, and that inspired her. Another one in Holmes County, Mississippi, a brother by the name of Eddie Noel, who shouted out with white folks. Here's a kind of interesting story. I always wondered why he wasn't killed, but later to find out that Eddie Noel had some white lineage or blood besides his black blood, and his one of the white folks who was a distant relative of his was a former governor of Mississippi, and they worked out a deal where he ended up in the crazy house as opposed to going to prison, and then somehow he gets out of there. But you have these black people who have this legendary status because they resisted segregation and white supremacy, and white folks wouldn't mess with them. Now, you probably, Baba, you probably knew Rudy Lombard. Was in C.O.R.E. Rudy Lombard gave me a great example. He said the movement was when everybody became bad Negroes. It wasn't just an exceptional person in our community, but we all become defiant. And that the people like C.O. Chin, who from being a young man, maintained that stance to becoming an elder in the community. Other people decide to be in league with him and decide they're going to resist. They're not going to take this stuff no more. And so I think it has an important, it's important that we recognize that there were people who always resisted. And it's important to note that there's a particular time when we all take that posture. We move from being inspired by them to being them. And that's when you see, when I saw what happened this summer, when young people were out in the street and willing to challenge, militarized police, they decided to take that posture and that stance that they weren't going to take it anymore. And so that's something that we should not only have these heroes of resistance, but to know that we can all become that. We can all resist on that level.
That's beautiful how you describe that. And I would just add to that we live in an environment, an oppressive environment, where fear is treated like it's normal. And the normalcy of fear is something that people take and live with and everything else and think is natural. And so when you tell people that it's an imposed system, you weren't born this way, babies are not born in fear, you're taught fear, that a lot of people will laugh like it's funny, because for them, fear has been their normal companion.
Right.
Yet fear is an unnatural thing and it's a false thing. And wherever fear is, you're locked out of freedom because you're frozen in that moment. Fear is the greatest inhibitor to growth. Mm-hmm. Whatever the growth is, fear works against it. So, but it's understandable why people have fear. I mean, mm-hmm. First of all, religion teaches you fear. The greatest fear of the bravest people I know is the IRS. I know black belts who give up their wealth going before the IRS when they don't have to.
Right.
Just
right,
document your stuff. But
right.
They just want to get them. And it's the Al Capone myth that they got Al Capone.
Right.
Yeah, he was a crook. You could get him on anything. You know what I mean? And they couldn't capture him on all the crime he did, so they got him on an IRS violation. You know what I mean? Right. So right. I mean, if the government's that bad, then chances are, if you're honest, you can get away with that. But I mean, so on almost every level, fear, and I hear these guys always talking about, well, if it wasn't for the fear of God, I wouldn't be the person I am right now. Do you really believe that? You know what I mean? Right. So this bad black person, this bad Negro, we all know the term that's usually used, which is treated as an unnatural state for most blacks, because in the situations they were living, to do what they did was life-threatening.
Right.
But the fact of living in a state of fear is one of the worst things that can happen to your health and everything else. And I speak from experience. I only had one fear, the fear of the consequences of my own wrongdoing. I had that for a while. That's the Kemetic Judeo-Christian Islamic fear of going to hell.
Right. Right.
I didn't have a deep fear of that. And then one time I just came to grips with it. I said, well, what the hell is this about?
Right.
I haven't killed anybody, raped anybody. I'm probably not going there anyway. But if I do,
right,
fear ain't got nothing to do with it. I mean, I'm going to have to go. So do what you have to do to protect that. But that was it. So all I can say is fearlessness has its own strengths and weaknesses. The greatest weakness of fearlessness is that you can sometimes dismiss danger. And so you can put other people in danger if you're in that state. And I've always had to be careful with that, because I've tended to underestimate, even when I knew that I had people around me that could be a threat or this or that, I figured I could handle it. But then I realized, well, yeah, maybe I could, but what about the person next to me? And when I'm asleep, can I? You know what I mean? So sometimes fear, the lack of fear has its own problems. So you got to check yourself. But other than that, it's happiness, it's good health.
Right.
Um, it's always being yourself and living in the moment, not being frozen to some past event that has got you scared. So yeah, the bad black person that Dr. Akinyele Umoja is talking about, to maintain that under certain circumstances took a very exceptional person. But to be fearless, that's something you need to work on, because whatever fear you got, check it out. It's usually false. It's
Mm-hmm.
usually what you're fearing that's the problem. As Roosevelt said, the only thing you have to fear is fear itself. Fear is an illusion. So, this bad, black person, we've always had some of them. And I like how you closed it on, there's a certain point where all of us begin to take on that mentality,
Right.
because the myths are exploded, you know?
Right. Right. And it's a major way that we're kept oppressed. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So I like how you put that in terms of fear. That's one of the when people asked me to propose this book, I said that armed resistance became a key factor in breaking down this thing about fear and intimidation in our minds, that kind of changed the equation for us and made us new Black people.
Mhm. Okay. Is there anything you want to say in concluding remarks?
Man, I appreciate this conversation. Uh, Again, in leading up to the conversation and even reviewing particularly the piece on the blues, I just thought about how we're connected. Like I said, we've never been in the same specific organization, but I think my teachers and elders come and were associated with you. And so I think that what you all were formulating has an impact on me, and in turn has an impact on generations who came in the movement after me. And so I want to thank you for that. I want to thank you for this opportunity to have this conversation. I'm looking forward to the next conversations we have.
And I want to thank you for your brilliance, your love of your people, being a good father, a good husband, um, good family man, and someone that's passed on a good legacy to a lot of young people. And we have one of them on our faculty at San Francisco State.
Yes, I'm proud of her.
Uh,
I was thinking about giving her a call because she might be in town. She usually comes in town around this time period, but I'm not sure because of the restrictions if she's here. Dr. Ife Flannery, we call her Ife Obuya. That's her clan name she received here at Georgia State in our Africana Studies program. We would give certain cohorts an African name. Her family name's Obuya.
Oh, I thought she was in Atlanta right now.
She might be. She
Yeah.
might be. I know she was working on that book this semester.
Yeah.
But she might be here. I haven't talked to her in about 3 weeks. I need to give her a call.
Yeah.
I'm proud of her too.
Yeah, me too. Little lady with a lot of gumption.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And smarts.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay, I want to thank you, brother. Now, some questions have come in here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I forgot it was live.
Yeah. So, one, let's see if I can get to the top of this.
Brother John, you want to read to you?
Yeah, I can't see the top of his question.
Essentially, he's been miseducated for 60 years, and do you have any advice for him?
Yeah, there's a brother,
John Jackson.
John Jackson. He said that he had been miseducated for 60 years, and apparently he's undergone some awakening now. And did I have any advice for him? Do you have any advice for him, Akinyele?
Man, well, most people I tell them, they ask me what to read, and I for some reason I start with the book that started me, the autobiography of Malcolm X. So that's one I would just say read. I'm sure we can on this show give you a list of books to read and just to be in conversation with people, find like-minded people who can give you information and direction, because you can do some of this on your own, but it's best to do it in conversation with others and with community. So look for other like-minded people who you could be in conversation with, even in this period of time of COVID. Through you obviously have some technology, so listen for other lecturers, be in conversation, ask those questions as you're doing right now. Don't just be satisfied with what you're hearing, but ask questions, even things you might disagree. But start off, I would say, read that book, Autobiography of Malcolm X. That was a reason why I suggest that book, because it shows his awakening experience. And that's one of the things I think Dr. Obitashaka and also another one of my elders, Vunilela Wabogo, they both talk about this awakening experience and this transformation. And we go through that. We go through different steps. Everybody does. And at a certain point, and this is one of the things I learned from Dr. Obitashaka, looking at the Dogon period of transformation, their steps to transformation. You get at a certain point, you're going to constantly engage and learn even more and more. It begins to move you. One of the organizations I was a part of, the House of Umoja, was founded by Mamadou Lumumba. We talked about this threefold path to Umoja, and the last path was sustenance through knowledge, the constant interaction, not only with the movement, with other people, and with studying. You constantly revive yourself. So, but that first step, you're just inspired to act. And then from being inspired to act, then you have to get some enlightenment by reason. So it's important to study, get information. And we have this technology today. You don't just have to do it through books by yourself, but, you know, look for conscious videos. But not only that, we talked about culture earlier. There's music that inspires you too, right? And so I remember when I was younger listening to Gil Scott-Heron, but not only the music with words, but my wife this morning was listening to John Coltrane. It was a certain energy or feeling that Coltrane puts you in, right? So, and you said you've been this way for 60 years. You might relate to that Coltrane music, right? You know, whereas it might take my son a minute. You know, my son in his 30s listens to Train. I think, so, you know, look for the music, look for the poetry that's going to rebuild that spirit in you. So those are some of the suggestions I would give.
One of the questions coming from Lao Tzu, the concept of block organizing. Can you expand on it a bit more? Do you want to do something on that?
I can say a little bit, but of course, you got one of the master teachers on that who's hosting the program. But I say block organizing really deals, we talked about before, building a relationship. So as organizers, how do I go into a community and learn the people, Obitashaka talked about knowing what people's desires are. Do block by block organizing, you do that. Now, somebody just came and while we were doing this program, knocked a vote early sign on my door because we're in this race in Georgia. But block by block organizing not only would drop this off, but it would build a relationship with the people in the community. And it would also do an analysis in our organizing here in Georgia. And with the Malcolm X grassroots movement, we instruct organizers to do area operations. So we would not only know the institutions and important things in that community, but we know the people. So there are some natural political leaders in a community. Might be some like rank and file folk from a church, might be the person who's over already existing Black organization, might be the leader of the local street organization or so-called gang. But to know that community and then to begin to work with those folks to develop their own grassroots organization. So they're organized as a people. That's what block by block organizing. That's elementary part of it. But again, we're on. I'm being interviewed by somebody who's a master teacher, who's an adept of Walimu and that form of politics, block by block organized. I'm sure Obadishaka has more to say on that.
It is the method of organizing that has been successfully used all over the world. I was in Cuba in 1983, 1984, along with Reverend Herbert Dowtry, who was then national chair of the Black United Front. I was national vice chair. He was also a minister to Tupac. Ex-con had served 2 terms before he really woke up. He's still alive and vegetarian and good health. And while there, I studied CDRs, Committees for the Defense of the Revolution. That's their block structure.
Right.
Anywhere in the world that you've seen successful organizing, this is the template, the most important template for organizing, because it's the format that allows you to organize a whole people. And it's a difficult process, especially when you're doing it the way we are, because in the case of Cuba, they have a government in place.
Right, exactly.
Or in the case of the poverty program, we had funding so we could fund it from the top down, but that came out of a movement. I mean, I led taking over that poverty program. So literally for 3 years, we put 25% of the money into Chinatown, 25% into Latino community, because I formed a group where I led Chinese, Latinos, and Blacks. Do you know that?
Yeah, I did actually.
Yeah. And so as a result, we literally controlled the thing for the whole city, but that was top down. So bottom up is harder,
right?
But it's doable,
right?
And so the idea is it's setting up structures on a block and getting people involved on a block in a structure, but you need an overall structure for this to work. And then engaging people get engaged on the issues that affect them where they live. And people determine what those issues are. And they're usually very important to people living in the area. You don't know until you deal with the block. And as Akinyele, Dr. Umoja said, it's forging relationships. And in our case, where a lot has been done to break up neighborhoods and communities, it's a process of rebuilding. It's hard work, but it's rewarding work. And over time, it enables you to create a system, and that system can be used for all kinds of things. Issues that have to deal with families can be resolved there. Issues that have to deal with economics are really key there. And a lot of things that are disruptive in our community, eventually, they've got to be addressed on that level. So it's the eyes and ears for any organization. If you want to know what's going on, you need a structure like that. It just has so many different valuable uses. Electoral politics is one, but it's secondary. I gave the example of Harold Washington, but that's not the primary reason for doing this, because that ties you into formal structures. And the problem is with all city structures is they're controlled by economic elites in a city.
Right.
So if your structure is mainly for that purpose, then you sucked yourself into the larger power structure. So that should not be the primary avenue for this kind of structure. Electoral politics is one arena, it's secondary. The primary arena is the streets. Right. The primary arena is the people. and people who belong to no organization. So it's setting up an overall structure that applies to a city or to a particular geographical area in a city, and then going step by step to create that. And you have to build cores of people who can organize that. And you have people with talent in communities already that have some of those skills. And some of them come directly out of the electoral political arena, of
Right.
which I've never engaged in because I just didn't think it was necessary. I thought other people could handle that. And plus, I'm not interested in co-optation.
No doubt.
So you don't have to be co-opted to be in it. That
Right.
just isn't my arena. But for other people, fine. And some people in this arena who are in electoral politics, they know how this works too. And they can be utilized, but they have to be politicized. The people who do it have to undergo transformational consciousness. They have to have a commitment to placing the people before themselves. They have to be very dedicated people. And that's the core of the people that should make up your organizing team. And that's something we can train people in. And we have some people that have done this very effectively that can assist in this all over the country, you know. Let's see if there's anything else. Oh, here's one, John Jackson. Given the fact that we're in a European dominated society that's firmly entrenched in the idea of their own superiority, is an armed response for our people realistic? I hope people don't get the idea that the purpose of this discussion was to prepare you for an armed response. It's not. It's to give you a history of armed resistance movements. So Akinyele, you want to respond to that one?
Yes, I think the main thing that our people need to be prepared for, if we're talking about power, is some of the things we talked about today. Being fearless, I think, is at the root of it. Uh, the main thing is we give the system our consent really in governing us. So can our people become ungovernable if we want a different system? That's the main question. It's not really about armed self-defense or utilizing arms. But I will say this, and we'll discuss this in really our third session, I think, when we come together. Um, the way things are now should tell us that we have to be willing to protect and defend our communities. Um, this government, as Malcolm said, decades ago, has either been unwilling or unable to protect us. So when we look at, for instance, here in Georgia, the young man, Ahmaud Arbery, was basically lynched on the street. It wasn't until there was a mobilization of our people that his murderers were held in some account. It didn't happen automatically. It happened because people protested, right? And so we should not feel secure in this society uh, just relying upon the general normal processes of government. Do we have to begin to protect our elders? When I think about what happened years ago in a church in Charleston, South Carolina, in Mother AME Church there, where somebody came to Bible study and killed the elders in church. That's a place that's supposed to be a sanctuary. We have to be prepared to defend, protect our people no matter where they are, to protect our neighborhoods. And, I think about one of my young friends in the struggle, Rosa Clemente. She's the one that made me aware of what was happening in Michigan when an armed militia, calling themselves an armed militia, a white supremacist, planned to take the governor, to kidnap her and ultimately murder her, right? And the comment Rosa Clemente made was, if they were planning to do that with her, what do you think their plans are for somebody like over to Shaka and myself. For you, Brother Jackson, what are their plans for us? We have to be prepared to defend ourselves. We can't rely upon the government to do this. And this is getting to, this isn't ideological Black nationalism, as we talked about earlier. This is just some common sense that we got to be able to protect and defend ourselves. And so we'll be talking about that in upcoming sessions. But it's important. It's not a question of seizing power. It's just a question of protecting our lives and valuing our lives. If we say Black Lives Matter, then we got to be willing to take that responsibility.
Yeah, very well put. And in Malcolm X's writings, his autobiography had missing chapters. And by the way, I knew this in 1966. Just didn't include it in my first book. And I know more than anyone else has put out on exactly what was involved in that. When I do a rewrite on Malcolm, I'll bring it out. But one of the things that was the missing chapter in his autobiography was on economic development. And one of the points he made was that any economic system you build, you have to be able to defend it.
Mm-hmm.
And this has been one of our vulnerabilities. You've given examples you'll go into in the next session on how Blacks who own stuff have been moved on, you know. With violence or the threat of violence, just take their stuff from them. So this self-defense tradition is about you being able to know that you have a tradition of protecting your families and your communities, but also the value and the necessity of it to keep your stuff. Now, I know people value their stuff, whatever your stuff is. You don't want anybody coming up and taking it. And I just give one example. And I think I mentioned this once before. There was an incident with the Nation of Islam where the mafia had been trying to exact taxes on Nation of Islam businesses. And Elijah called a meeting of the leader of the mafia, the head of the mafia family, to his mansion and issued an order: leave the Muslims alone. And the mafia backed off. And there is also in the film on Muhammad Ali, I've mentioned this before, where he plays the role of Muhammad Ali, where after he knocks out Sonny Liston, he's then negotiating a contract, and the mafia is there because they had owned Sonny Liston. And so they told him that they could take out his family. Well, he had Herbert Muhammad, who was almost as big a crook as the mafia. And I don't care anybody in the nation who hears this, it's the truth. He ripped off Muhammad Ali as best he could. But still, this was a time where it was a lesser of two evils. And so he said to the mafia, we can take out your family too.
Wow.
That was the end of any problem that Muhammad Ali had with the mafia. He signed with the Nation of Islam. You know what I mean? The mafia was out of the picture. Why? The mafia, that's the only group the mafia feared at that point. I don't think that's the case now. But then, because these guys had a background, and in prison, they were more deadly than anything the mafia had. And they knew also the discipline that the nation imposed on its own members. I won't go into some of it. It was pretty harsh stuff. And so they knew what would happen if they crossed them. And they knew they were all over the place.
Right.
And they would consider it fanaticism, but it was belief. Right. But it was also protecting what you have.
Right.
So that's fundamental. I know everybody is committed to protecting their wives and children. Are you prepared to is another question. You certainly have the desire to.
Right.
You need to be prepared to. And whatever you have, the same way. Be security conscious.
Right.
Watch where you're going. All this stuff. You know what I mean? So this was not a discussion to be talking about no armed struggle or overthrowing the government or nothing. I'm not done. I'm not doing that. You know what I mean? And the people that want to do that, that's your business.
Right.
But this is about what's our traditions
Right.
for keeping us alive.
Right.
And it's very important. Just as they say, a mind is a terrible thing to waste, a life is even more terrible to lose. You know what I mean? Your
Right.
own or anybody else's. So this has been pure enjoyment for me. This went longer than any of our other shows have gone. I don't care. You know what I mean? This has been pure pleasure. And Dr. Akinyele Umoja, ain't too often, you get a world-class scholar who can give you all kinds of information and at the same time has got a spirit of fighting back. You know what I mean?
Shay.
You got anything final you want to say? And then we're finished here.
Oh man, I actually said it a little while ago, but I'll say it again. It's been a pleasure being on here with somebody who I respect and known for decades. And we just wish you all the blessings in the world to continue the work of our ancestors. Again, as I see Cabral over one shoulder and Malcolm over the other, I know Ella Baker is in there too. So seeing you continuing their work and their legacy. I know Marcus Garvey's in there too. Knowing your work, that you're continuing their work. I know Dr. Clark is in there too.
Oh yeah.
and numerous unnamed Babalaos that you continue
like
their legacy.
Asa Hilliard, who you once said, when I grow up, I want to be like him. I saw a picture with you in front of a magnificent picture of Dr. Asa Hilliard.
Right.
One wonderful human being.
Yes, sir. He's one of the best men I know. We took that picture when I became chair of the department. And one of the best gifts I've ever received is after I was named chair, my brother Watani gave he and his wife, Ahadi Tayemba, they gave a celebration. And Dr. Hilliard's family, Mama Patsy Joe and Hakeem and his daughter, not Trish, but she's gonna kill me for forgetting her name right now. But they came to the party and they brought me one of Asa's royal boobas in celebration of me becoming a chair. And they said he would, if he was here today, he would want you to have this. And so that's been one of the most cherished gifts that I've ever received from the Hilliard family. And his daughter Trish passed this year.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, she passed back in the spring. My wife and I went to go visit Mama Patsy Joe before she went to the funeral. It was one of the most difficult times I've had during this pandemic because we went by her house, in the tradition to take some food, but because of this COVID thing, I couldn't hug her. And I just I'm tearing up a little bit now thinking about that. But no, you're right. Asa Hilliard is one of our cultural giants, one of our spiritual and intellectual giants. And he's somebody who I hold in the highest respect as an ancestor. And when we think about, we both talked about Ifa earlier, and they say in Ifa, I think it's in Eje-Obe in the sacred oracle Ifa, they say the human being can become Orisha. In other words, some of our ancestors are deified to a certain level. And Asa, I say, fits in that category. When I think of Asa, I think of the finest of our New African intellectual traditions. And so and you walk in that tradition too, sir. So we salute you for that and continue that work.
Yeah, for people that don't know, Dr. Asa Hilliard was the Dean of Education at San Francisco State and then had an endowed chair at Georgia State where he could do anything he wanted. It's interesting that some powerful whites actually liked him.
Everybody
Right, exactly. Liked Asa.
Yeah, it's hard not to like him. At least you didn't want to admit in public that you didn't like him if you were white, because his character was so high and he was so beloved.
Yeah.
It would be hard to attack him publicly if you wanted to not just be totally isolated in our community.
And then when it comes to brilliance, he was exceptionally brilliant, but he was a humble human being. The owner of Marcus Bookstore, again, Julian Richardson, made a comment to me once. He said, you know, Asa Hilliard is the only person I know that I've never heard anything negative about. And I said, yeah, that's true. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because he was such a kind person, I owe being tenured at San Francisco State in part to him, because he was chair of the tenure committee and was fighting on my behalf. The FBI was trying to deny me tenure through a COINTELPRO, but Asa was in there fighting for me. But he did that for a whole lot of people. Just an exceptional human being, a wonderful person, a great scholar. He read more than anybody. I read all the time. Asa read more than me. And I'd call up Asa and say, hey, Asa, what should I read? And it'd be
I remember you told me that.
a million books.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was. So that's a part of this journey. When you're on a journey of free the mind, you're on the journey of trying to be engaged in a process for supporting your people for liberation. You come in contact with some amazing people.
Right.
And Asa would be at the top, but then just so many everyday people I've known that have that same quality, that Asa had, that makes life just worth living and makes you love being Black.
I say.
Just wonderful. And he always had a saying, that his boss was his wife. He had to get permission to come into town because she was the mayor of that area. But
right. East Point.
She's also a Leo. And Asa was between Leo and Virgo. So if you went into his office, he'd always have a big lion there. He was identifying more with the lion, the Leo part, but that made him a complex person. But the point is, yeah, that was just seeing the picture of you in front of a picture with Asa, that just warmed my heart. I said,
oh man, he's certainly inspiration. You mentioned good character with him, and humility. One time, there was a period of time that I had a program going into the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, and Asa asked, could he go? I didn't have to solicit. And he went inside the penitentiary and to deliver a message to a class. We had about 35 inmates. One of the Asa said something, and one of the young men in the audience corrected him. And many of the PhDs we know would have been defensive, but Asa sat back and reflected, and he said to the young man, you know something, you're right. Somebody's been studying in here. So he not only wasn't defensive, but he affirmed the young brother. And, I just took that as a big example that, you shouldn't be intimidated by our people. You should listen to them and affirm them when they're correct. Yeah. and so, I just love that about him.
Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful man.
Yeah. So I want to thank you, brother. This has been pure pleasure. You know what I mean? I look forward to the next two.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah. And
thanks
tell your wife I said hello, and your children, which I know they're not children anymore.
Yeah, they're grown. My daughter has 5 children of her own now.
Wow.
Yeah.
How many grandchildren you have?
5. All of them with her. She and my son-in-law are going to Benin next month, so the 5 will be here with us.
Okay, good.
The oldest one will help with the younger one. The oldest one goes to Georgia State, and yeah, she'll be in her 2nd year at Georgia State. Actually, first year at Georgia State, she went to Temple last year. she decided to come back home.
Okay. So I want to thank you, brother. And everybody can enjoy part 2 of this next Saturday. Thanks, brother.
We'll be listening in. Let me see. Next Saturday is the 26th. So yeah, we'll do it early enough because first day of Kwanzaa, we'll be doing Umoja at my house, and we'll be hooding my son because he just got newly minted PhD, and he's gonna do his hooding ceremony here at the house.
Okay, that's good.
We'll tell folks if they want to see it on Facebook Live.
Okay. So we'll work that out.
Yes, sir.
Sante, brother.
It's the key too, and free the land. Stay strong, Baba.
Right on, brother. Hey.